A single encrypted message leaves Japanese naval headquarters. Routine transmission. Standard cipher. It contains Admiral Yamamoto's complete flight itinerary for the following day. 48 hours later, 16 American P-38 fighters appear over the Solomon Islands. They're not searching. They're not on patrol. They know exactly where to be. Down to the minute. Japan's greatest admiral, the man who designed Pearl Harbor's dead before his plane hits the jungle. But here's what nobody ever talks about. Japan had been reading American codes for 20 years. They had listening stations in Mexico picking up signals from Washington. They cracked encryption that Britain and Germany never could. So how did the hunters become the hunted? The answer brought down an empire. Welcome to History of World War II. Subscribe now. You've never heard this story told like this. To understand how Japanese intelligence failed so catastrophically, you need to understand how brilliantly it once succeeded. Because here's the thing, most people never learn about World War II. Japan didn't just have intelligence services. For decades, they had better intelligence than almost anyone else in Asia. Their codebreakers achieved things that left British and German cryptographers stunned. Their spy networks stretched from Hawaii to Mexico to the heart of China. This wasn't some amateur operation. This was world-class intelligence work. And it all began in 1890. Japan was transforming. The samurai era was dead. A new industrial military power was clawing its way onto the world stage. But Japanese generals faced a terrifying reality. European empires were carving up Asia like a Christmas roast. China was being devoured piece by piece, and Japan could easily be next on the menu. They needed intelligence. They needed to know what was coming. But here's how they started, and this will surprise you. A Japanese businessman living in Shanghai receives a letter from a military officer back home. The letter essentially says, "Anything interesting happening there? Any military gossip? Write back if you hear something." That was Japanese intelligence in 1890, asking expats to mail rumors. Then one man changed everything. His name was TWhy. This army officer established something called the Institute for Sino-Japanese Trade. Boring name, deliberately boring, because this organization had nothing to do with trade. It was Japan's first dedicated intelligence operation, and its target was China. Japan was planning war, what would become the First Sino-Japanese War. They faced what seemed like an impossible problem. The Chinese army was enormous. On paper, Japan should be crushed. But Arise Networks discovered something Beijing desperately wanted to hide. The Chinese military was rotting from the inside. Officers had purchased their commissions. Soldiers had never been properly trained. Equipment lists were pure fantasy weapons that existed on paper, had never been manufactured. Entire units were ghosts, created only to justify budgets. Armed with this intelligence, Japan struck in 1894. Fast, brutal, overwhelming. China collapsed in months. So if Japanese intelligence worked this brilliantly, what went wrong? Stay with me, because the seeds of disaster were planted in their next victory. A few years later, Japanese attention turned north, to a far more dangerous enemy, Russia. The Russian Empire was one of the great powers of the world. Their army had crushed Napoleon. Their navy terrified Europe. Their territory stretched across 11 time zones. Japanese intelligence went to work, and they found the weakness. Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't complete. Moving reinforcements to the Far East would take months. The Russian forces in Manchuria were isolated, vulnerable. Alone, Japanese analysts reached a clear conclusion. A long war against Russia meant certain defeat, but quick, decisive strikes before Russian logistics could catch up. That might work. They called it the Prussian model. Swift tactical victories. Destroy the enemy before they can fully mobilize. Japan attacked in 1904. Port Arthur fell. The Russian fleet was annihilated at Tsushima. The mighty Russian Empire sued for peace. The world was stunned. An Asian nation defeating a European great power. It had never happened in modern history. Japanese military leaders celebrated their genius. Quick strikes, decisive battles, victory before the enemy can react. This became their doctrine, their religion, their fatal blind spot, because they learned exactly the wrong lesson. They came to believe every war could be won this way. They built their entire military around this assumption. They structured their intelligence services to support short, decisive campaigns. What they completely missed was the concept of total war that was emerging in the 20th century. Wars won not through brilliant tactics, but through industrial capacity, through resources, through the ability to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. This blind spot would destroy them. If this is changing how you see the war drop, a comment. I read every one. But first came the Golden Age. After the Russian victory, Japan finally built a proper intelligence apparatus. The Army created the second department under the General Staff, focused on code breaking. The Navy established its own separate signals intelligence unit. And the results were extraordinary. By the 1920s, 2 decades before, Pearl Harbor Japanese codebreakers had fully cracked the diplomatic ciphers of Britain, the United States, and China. They could read enemy communications like open mail. They didn't stop there. Japan cracked American strip ciphers encryption so sophisticated that neither Britain nor Germany ever broke it. Not once, not ever. But Japan did. They positioned a converted oil tanker near Hawaii just to intercept U.S. Navy radio traffic. They built a secret listening post in Mexico that picked up signals from Washington, D.C. and New York. Think about what this means. Before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan could read American military communications. They knew what the Pacific Fleet was planning. They knew what messages were flowing between Washington and commanders at sea. British codes were harder. Years of painstaking work. Then, in 1934, a breakthrough. A Japanese typist working at the British consulate in Sapporo waited until no one was watching. Then she threw a codebook out the window. Japanese intelligence picked it up from the street. Both branches duplicated effort constantly. Both spent resources achieving the same intelligence goals independently. Both jealously guarded their secrets not from the enemy, but from each other. And it gets worse. The Foreign Ministry gathered its own intelligence through diplomatic channels. Did they share with the military? Almost never. Japan had 3 separate intelligence operations working in complete isolation. 3 sets of codebreakers. 3 spy networks. 3 chains of command. 0 coordination. But the fragmentation wasn't even the deadliest problem. The deadliest problem was how intelligence officers were treated. In the Japanese military, intelligence work was seen as shameful, lesser. Officers called intelligence staff messenger boys behind their backs. Getting assigned to intelligence wasn't a career opportunity, was a punishment. A sign that your career was over. Think about what this means. The people responsible for understanding the enemy. The analysts who needed to warn commanders about threats. They were understaffed, disrespected, often completely unqualified for the work. They were the rejects, the failures, the officers nobody else wanted. And when they did produce accurate intelligence, commanders ignored it. Generals routinely cherry-picked information that supported whatever they already wanted to do. If intelligence said the enemy was stronger than expected, change the estimate. If analysts warned about a potential trap, miss them. If reports contradicted the commander's plans, bury them. This wasn't a bug in the system. This was the system. Intelligence existed to support decisions that had already been made. Not to inform those decisions, not to challenge assumptions. Just to provide justification after the fact. Almost all of Japan's code-related efforts focused on breaking enemy ciphers. Their own encryption remained dangerously underdeveloped. The Imperial Japanese Navy used essentially to cipher systems throughout the entire war. Both could be at least partially cracked by British and American intelligence. The Navy was complacent. Senior officers simply believed their codes couldn't be broken. This arrogance meant codebooks were rarely changed and frequently used improperly. Standard procedures were ignored. Security protocols were treated as suggestions. American cryptographers exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. They cracked Japanese naval codes just before the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Midway became one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese fleet would appear. They knew the attack plan. They were waiting. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval aviation were destroyed in a single day. The Navy's own logs admitted the enemy had grasped their intentions beforehand. But instead of investigating their compromised codes, the Admiralty blamed everything else. Bad luck, American spies. Anything except the obvious truth. No significant changes were made to their cipher systems. Here's where the institutional dysfunction becomes truly catastrophic. The Army knew about vulnerabilities in Navy codes. They had suspected for some time that Americans might be reading naval communications. Did they warn the Navy? No. The inter-service rivalry was so poisonous that this critical information was unshared until 1943, more than a year after Midway. After Yamamoto's assassination, after incalculable damage had already been done, the Army would rather watch the Navy fail than help them succeed. This is history they never taught you. Subscribe if you want more. Despite all these problems, Japanese intelligence still achieved moments of genuine brilliance. In 1940, Japan could read diplomatic communications from France, Britain, the United States, and China simultaneously. After Paris fell to Germany, Japanese analysts began intercepting everything about French Indochina. What they discovered was remarkable. No country was willing or able to defend Indochina. France was occupied. Britain was fighting for survival. America wasn't ready. China couldn't project power that far. Indochina was completely alone. Japan moved before anyone could react. They simply walked in. Minimal resistance. Maximum strategic gain. Intelligence had delivered a nearly bloodless victory. The same pattern appeared in Hong Kong. A Japanese organization called the Koei Kicom, the Asia Development Agency, had been operating in Hong Kong since early 1941. Officers worked with local triad gangs to build bombs and sabotage British installations. They dug tunnels across the border to help the coming invasion, but their masterstroke was simpler than any of that. During the Battle of Hong Kong, they seized the main water reservoirs. No water for a crowded city under siege. The British garrison surrendered in days. Human intelligence operations also scored significant successes. Takeo Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii in early 1941 under a false name with diplomatic cover. For months, he did something brilliantly simple. He joined tourist groups, regular civilian tours around Oahu, the kind any visitor could take. He visited scenic overlooks, took photographs, made careful notes. What he was actually doing was mapping every ship in Pearl Harbor, logging patrol schedules, tracking exactly where each vessel anchored. His intelligence was critical to planning the December 7th attack. The Navy was complacent. Senior officers simply believed their codes couldn't be broken. This arrogance meant codebooks were rarely changed and frequently used improperly. Standard procedures were ignored. Security protocols were treated as suggestions. American cryptographers exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. They cracked Japanese naval codes just before the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Midway became one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese fleet would appear. They knew the attack plan. They were waiting. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval aviation were destroyed in a single day. The Navy's own logs admitted the enemy had grasped their intentions beforehand. But instead of investigating their compromised codes, the Admiralty blamed everything else. Bad luck, American spies, anything except the obvious truth. No significant changes were made to their cipher systems. Here's where the institutional dysfunction becomes truly catastrophic. The Army knew about vulnerabilities in Navy codes. They had suspected for some time that Americans might be reading naval communications. Did they warn the Navy? No. The inter-service rivalry was so poisonous that this critical information was unshared until 1943, more than a year after Midway. After Yamamoto's assassination, after incalculable damage had already been done, the Army would rather watch the Navy fail than help them succeed. This is history they never taught you. Subscribe if you want more. Despite all these problems, Japanese intelligence still achieved moments of genuine brilliance. In 1940, Japan could read diplomatic communications from France, Britain, the United States, and China simultaneously. After Paris fell to Germany, Japanese analysts began intercepting everything about French Indochina. What they discovered was remarkable. No country was willing or able to defend Indochina. France was occupied. Britain was fighting for survival. America wasn't ready. China couldn't project power that far. Indochina was completely alone. Japan moved before anyone could react. They simply walked in. Minimal resistance, maximum strategic gain. Intelligence had delivered a nearly bloodless victory. The same pattern appeared in Hong Kong. A Japanese organization called the Koei Kikant Aisha Development Agency had been operating in Hong Kong since early 1941. Officers worked with local triad gangs to build bombs and sabotage British installations. They dug tunnels across the border to help the coming invasion. But their masterstroke was simpler than any of that. During the Battle of Hong Kong, they seized the main water reservoirs. No water for a crowded city under siege. The British garrison surrendered in days. Human intelligence operations also scored significant successes. Takeo Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii in early 1941 under a false name with diplomatic cover. For months, he did something brilliantly simple. He joined tourist groups. Regular civilian tours around Oahu, the kind any visitor could take. He visited scenic overlooks, took photographs, made careful notes. What he was actually doing was mapping every ship in Pearl Harbor, logging patrol schedules, tracking exactly where each vessel anchored. His intelligence was critical to planning the December 7th attack. Japan even cracked BAME's the broadcast to Allied merchant shipping after Germany captured a codebook and shared it. This allowed Japan to track Allied merchant traffic patterns and sometimes predict American operations weeks in advance. These were real achievements, genuine intelligence successes. So with capabilities like these, how did Japan end up losing the intelligence war completely? Because every success was undermined by catastrophic failure. Guadalcanal, 1943. Japanese intelligence assessed American troop strength on the island. Their estimate, approximately 1,000 soldiers. The actual number was 20,000. They were wrong by a factor of 20. Japanese forces attacked, expecting light resistance. They walked into a meat grinder. Wave after wave of soldiers died, assaulting positions that intelligence said barely existed. Even after this disaster, nothing changed. The system remained broken. Then came the catastrophe that proved beyond any doubt how completely Japanese intelligence had collapsed. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. A week before the main battle, American carriers struck Japanese positions on Taiwan. Most Japanese aircraft on the island were destroyed. A few American cruisers were damaged. 0 American ships were sunk. That was reality. But Imperial headquarters reported something very different. Their official assessment claimed 19 American aircraft carriers and 4 battleships had been sunk. 19 carriers, when the actual number was 0. Japanese Navy intelligence knew something was wrong. They intercepted American communications. The Americans weren't acting like a fleet that had just lost half its carriers. The evidence was clear. The report was fantasy. So the admirals had a choice. Believe their own intelligence analysts or believe the lie. They believed the lie. Why? Because they desperately wanted to fight a decisive battle against a crippled American fleet. The fantasy told them what they wanted to hear. Here's where it becomes truly catastrophic. The Navy didn't share this intelligence conflict with the Army. Army commanders were planning the ground defense of the Philippines. They needed accurate information about American naval strength to make sound decisions. They never got it. Based on the fantasy that the American fleet was crippled, the Army changed their entire strategy. Instead of a deep defense on Luzon that could bleed Americans for months, they concentrated forces on the beaches at Leyte. The logic seemed sound. If the Navy destroys what's left of the American fleet, any landing force will be weak and easily defeated. The American fleet arrived at full strength. The Army faced overwhelming force they had been told no longer existed. Reinforcements sent to Leyte were destroyed in transit by American air power that was supposed to be eliminated. Leyte Gulf became a catastrophe. Japanese naval power was broken permanently. Afterward, the Army blamed Navy. Navy blamed Army. No one blamed the actual problem and intelligence system so broken it could uncommunicate truth even to its own commanders. We're approaching the end. If this opened your eyes, hit like. It genuinely helps. April 1943. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Japan's greatest strategic mind is flying to inspect forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His complete itinerary is transmitted by radio. Flight times, route, arrival schedule, every detail. The transmission uses the Navy's standard cipher. The same cipher they'd been using for over a year. The same cipher American codebreakers had cracked before Midway. The same cipher nobody bothered to change. American intelligence intercepts the message. They decode it within hours. They know exactly where Yamamoto will be, exactly when. 16 P-38 fighters take off from Guadalcanal. They fly over 400 miles across open ocean. They navigate to a precise intercept point. They arrive at exactly the right moment. Yamamoto's plane appears exactly where intelligence predicted. The fighters attack. Both Japanese bombers are shot down. Yamamoto is killed instantly, still strapped in his seat when his plane crashes into the jungle. Japan's greatest naval commander is dead. All because of a routine radio message sent using a compromised cipher. The Navy investigates. Surely there's been a security breach. A traitor. A spy who leaked the information. Their conclusion: bad luck. An unfortunate coincidence. The Americans must have simply stumbled across him by accident. They never seriously considered that their codes might be compromised. Because admitting that would mean admitting they had failed. And admitting failure was impossible. The cipher system that killed Yamamoto remained in use. Late in the war, the Army achieved one final technical success. Using IBM computers seized from Japanese insurance companies and hundreds of mathematics students from Tokyo Imperial University, they developed a sophisticated system for tracking American B-29 bombers. The system worked. It could predict bomber locations approximately 80% of the time. Numerous American aircraft were shot down thanks to this intelligence capability. The system even tracked two very special B-29s, the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the planes that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese intelligence tracked them. They knew these aircraft were airborne. They knew their general flight paths. But here's the final tragic irony. The word nuclear wasn't decoded from intercepted communications until days after both cities were destroyed. They tracked the planes. Well, they never understood what those planes were carrying until it was far too late. Tactical capability, strategic blindness. The story of Japanese intelligence in 6 words. By August 1945, it was over. The intelligence apparatus that had once cracked codes Britain and Germany never could was in ruins. The spy networks that had mapped Pearl Harbor and seized Hong Kong's water supply had been rolled up or rendered irrelevant. The war's outcome wouldn't have changed with better intelligence. Japan simply lacked the industrial capacity to defeat the United States in a prolonged conflict. The mathematics of total war were always against them, but the intelligence failures accelerated their defeat. Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Yamamoto's assassination. Each disaster traced back to the same systemic problems. An army and navy that would rather lose battles than share information. Commanders who ignored intelligence that contradicted their plans. A military culture that treated analysts as messenger boys, unworthy of respect. Codebreakers who cracked enemy ciphers while neglecting their own security. The Japanese military spent more energy fighting itself than fighting the enemy. 3 separate intelligence organizations. 3 competing priorities. 0 coordination. Individual brilliance scattered throughout the system. Yoshikawa mapping Pearl Harbor. Codebreakers defeating American strip ciphers. Operators seizing Hong Kong's water supply. None of it mattered, because the system was broken at its foundation. And no amount of individual talent could overcome institutional dysfunction. So what's the lesson? Intelligence is only as valuable as the system that uses it. Japan possessed world-class codebreakers, skilled operatives, technical capabilities their enemies never matched. They achieved genuine breakthroughs. None of it saved them. Because the military couldn't cooperate. Because commanders refused to listen. It's because institutional arrogance mattered more than uncomfortable truth. The failure of Japanese intelligence wasn't really about intelligence at all. It was about culture. A culture that viewed intelligence work as shameful. A culture where rivalry between services was more important than victory. A culture where admitting you might be wrong was absolutely unthinkable. These patterns don't just exist in history books. They exist today. In governments, in corporations, in organizations that should know better. The lessons of Japanese intelligence aren't just about World War II. They're warnings now. I mentioned Allied codebreaking earlier, Bletchley Park, the operation that helped win the war. But there's a story most people have never heard. What the Allies knew and what they deliberately let happen. Thousands died because of a secret kept for 40 years. That's coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for staying until the end. This is History of World War II.